Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us for tonight's educational webinar with Jim Weisman regarding fun with disability advocacy. We're still waiting for a couple more participants to join, so we appreciate your patience while we wait for others to join in. Good evening, everyone. Thank you again for your patience. We're going to be waiting around 3 more minutes before we start, just to make sure all participants can enter, and then we'll begin tonight's educational webinar. All right, good evening, everybody. Thank you for joining us for tonight's educational webinar, Fun with Disability Advocacy, featuring Jim Weisman. So for those of you who do not know, James Weisman is now General Counsel of United Spinal Association after years of service as President and CEO. He joined United Spinal as an attorney in 1979. This was back when United Spinal was then known as Eastern Paralyzed Veterans Association. 11 years before the passage of the American with Disabilities Act, Weisman sued New York City's transit system and won bus access, key subway and rail station access, and the creation of a paratransit program to supplement mass transit for those with disabilities, preventing them from using bus and rail system. He also sued Philadelphia's transit system, yielding similar results by 1988. He was a key negotiator with members of Congress, promoting the passage of the ADA and the Act's transportation provisions applied the agreements in New York City and Philadelphia to a whole country. He's a founding board member of the American Association of People with Disabilities. United Spinal, led by Weisman, is active in the disability rights movement and was successful in getting New York City to agree to make 50% of its yellow cabs accessible by 2020. He is routinely consulted by advocates, attorneys, employers, real estate developers, and others seeking to include people with disabilities in their workforce, programs, and customer bases. So we're very happy to have with us tonight, Jim Weisman.
Thank you. I hope you can hear me because I hate starting with, sorry, I'm on mute or whatever, you know. It's like blowing into the microphone and go, is this on? When you start with on mute. I called this Fun with Disability Advocacy for two reasons, really. One is that I've had a lot of fun and I want to tell you about it. But two is if I called it Disability Advocacy, we'd probably get only half the interest. But if you call it fun or sex or drugs or beer or money, people will pay attention. So fun was the most palatable. Next slide, please. Thanks. I wanted to just tell you a little bit about why I do what I do and success stories, lessons learned, and terrific confrontations between people with disabilities and authority figures, and how people with disabilities have scored points, won battles, told great jokes in public settings, and I promise to get to them. When I was 16 years old, I'm not disabled, although I'm going to be 70 and I have a million disabilities now. But when I was 16 years old, I had no summer job. My father told me you have to go to summer school. You're not lying on the couch. Well, if you don't get a job, and I couldn't find one, and I volunteered at a camp for disabled kids that I could take my bicycle to. I had a life-saving, senior life-saving, and I worked at the pool. And immediately, I mean, I never thought much about disabled people before that. I was 16. I didn't have disabled friends or relatives, and it wasn't on my radar. And when I got there, a day or two later, I realized that everybody is like everybody else, and people want to have a good time and laugh, and there's virtually no differences, I realized when I was 16, and I wondered why everything was so separate for people with disabilities. Maybe I did. I'm not sure if I did. I think I thought about it a lot the way I lived in New York. I lived in the suburbs then, but I'm from New York City. I was conscious that there were poor people and rich people when I was a child. I never thought much about, is it systemic racism that caused it? I just knew that Black people were poorer than white people as classes. It was upsetting. Brotherhood was on the table in public school every day when I was a kid, not like today. We don't even say brotherhood anymore because it's not gender neutral. But, Jackie Robinson came to my elementary school, and, these were icons of civil rights. We were actually right in our school talking to us. But I didn't feel like there's something when I was a child that I had to do to make the world a better place. I just didn't. I don't think it even crossed my mind. I went to this camp and I made friends with disabled teenagers who, my contemporaries. One of them was Paul Hearn. Paul Hearn was an osteogenesis imperfecta dwarf who was homebound until he was 13. He was now 17, I was 16. He had been emancipated, so to speak, by a school just for disabled kids. But he was, with the executone speaker in the room, in a classroom. The classroom was there, and he had a speaker it was in a public school, and he had a speaker in his room. And that's how he went to school until then, till he was 13. And when he graduated this school for disabled kids, he went to Hofstra University, and he was so garrulous and friendly and smart that he was student body president by the time he was a senior, and then went to law school at Hofstra. So we were friends all through college and high school without talking about disability rights, really. But I'd go places, we'd go to bars and restaurants, and people would say, "Don't put him there." And I would think that they were stupid. And I would say things like, "He speaks, talk to him," or, something like that. I didn't think there ought to be a law. I just didn't. Once we were at a party, and a girl slipped by the side of the pool and split her head open. And we jumped in Paul's car, and she had this bloody towel on her head with blood running down her forearm. And we jumped in Paul's car, and we drove to a hospital emergency room. And when we got there, she walked in with the two of us, Paul and I and this girl. And she's got the bloody towel on her head with the blood running down her arm. And I hold the door open for the two, like a swinging door for the two of them. And a guy goes, "I got it from here," and grabs Paul's chair and rushes him into the emergency room. Perfectly healthy guy. And she's getting stitches. She needs stitches. So, those things happened all the time, but I never really thought there ought to be a law. I just never did. The things that you experience day to day, those little slights that are people don't notice. I noticed, I did, but I just thought, I guess that's the way it is. I don't know what I thought. I went to law school. I went to law school with a disabled guy in my class, had muscular dystrophy. I saw him every day for 3 years, struggling, thought about it a lot. I used to see my friend Paul a lot. I went to the Hofstra dorms to visit him. They were having a fight because they wouldn't let them live above the first floor, anybody in a wheelchair. And they wanted to live wherever they wanted. Of course, they won that fight. Disabled people win all access fights. It's just when, not if. They won that fight. And I met a guy named Norm Coleman, who was a friend of Paul's. And Norm Coleman became the mayor of St. Paul. He's from Brooklyn. He became the mayor of St. Paul, Minnesota. Paul beat him for student body president. And then he became the senator from Minnesota, conservative Republican of all things. A Jewish guy from Brooklyn via Hofstra to St. Paul to the Senate. And then he was beaten by Al Franken some years ago. But being student body president really set Paul off, and he went to law school, and we met on the street in Manhattan. I was living in Manhattan then. I was just married. I was like 26. So I'd been married a few years already, but I was going to law school. I graduated law school. I meet Paul. He's 1 year out of law school. I meet him on the street, and incredibly, I'm holding the newspaper the New York Times, about the 504 regulation being signed by Secretary Califano, that was then called Health, Education, and Welfare, Jimmy Carter's secretary, signed the first regulations implementing Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act of 1973. This is 1977, so it was never enforced until 77, and it invented the concept of reasonable accommodation. And I thought it was remarkable, and I said to Paul, hey, this is amazing. And he says, it's just a piece of paper. You think it's going to change my life? And I thought he was unnecessarily bitter. And we went into a bar and sat down and talked for the first time in my life. I was 26. I'd been friends with him for 10 years. First time in my life about how we can use the law to change things for people with disabilities. One thing led to another, and I changed my career path from assistant district attorney in Brooklyn to working with Paul for Legal Services Corporation. We needed to raise money to open, there were 21 legal services offices in New York City, 19 were architecturally inaccessible. Paul met a guy who worked for Senator Javits. He got us an appointment with Jacob Javits in his New York office. We were driving up 3rd Avenue and Paul said, watch this, the negative presumption at work. I said, what is the negative presumption? He said, Javits will talk to you because I'm in a wheelchair and he'll think I'm a moron. And then when I speak up and I'm only as articulate as you are, Javits will feel guilty, overreact like I'm a genius, and do whatever we ask. And I remember saying, from your mouth to God's ears. But it was like he wrote the script for the meeting. That's exactly what occurred. Javits told us some fascinating stuff that he always thought America did right by disabled veterans, he said. But I saw Vietnam veterans, Purple Heart recipients, throwing their Purple Hearts back over the White House fence when they wouldn't sign Section 504 regulations. And I thought, this country is doing something wrong. And he and a congressman named Mario Biaggi got us money to open a Legal Services Corporation office where we really thought we would be doing domestic relations, landlord-tenant, Social Security, disability, welfare, things for poor disabled people who couldn't get into the other offices. And in fact, those people did come in. But so did every giant systemic discrimination lawsuit known to man. Transportation, housing, employment, education, everything was terrible. I don't know what else to say about it. It's like the Old Testament begins, in the beginning there was darkness. That's how this is. That's really how it was. Next slide, please. I threw this in to keep your attention. That's a SEPTA bus. I don't remember the occasion. I just don't. And I can't identify, maybe some of you can, old timers. The bald guy probably is pretty distinct, if you remember him. But I can't tell you what the event was. Or next slide, please. That's me, believe it or not, on the left. And I'll go back to this in a minute. Next slide, please. So for me, transportation, it was an amazing awakening to me of the incredible disregard for people with disabilities. The way transit was running in the United States when I started work in 77 as an attorney. I went, a woman named Frida Zames, who some of you may still remember, was a disability advocate in New York and took over Disabled in Action after Judy Heumann formed it and moved to Berkeley in New York City. Frida was a professor at Newark College of Engineering, and she was a PhD post-polio person on crutches, and she wanted me to go to an MTA, our transit authority in New York, to listen to Disabled in Action, a few of them testify asking for lifts on buses. 1977, in September 77. And I went, and when they were called on, the board of the MTA got up and milled around and walked around, talked to each other, got coffee, went to the bathroom. It was like it wasn't a public hearing anymore. It was pro forma. They were just going through the motions, not listening to these people, treating them like they were cranks or crackpots or kooks. The only thing I could say is it got under my skin and stayed there. I realized just how the incredible disregard for this population. It was just so apparent. These are responsible public servants, ostensibly, the board of a transit authority, and they're ignoring people with disabilities completely. So transportation's always been at the heart of civil rights. Plessy versus Ferguson is an 1896 US Supreme Court case that established separate but equal. It rendered legitimate Jim Crow laws. It was about rail cars and Black-only rail cars. And of course, separate was never equal, but it took until 1954, till Brown versus Board of Education, for the Supreme Court to reverse Plessy versus Ferguson. So separate became inherently unequal for, at least for racial minority, right? Disabled people copied the civil rights movements of Black people and women because there wasn't a lot of disability rights laws. But Section 504 was the first federal civil rights statute. It said recipients of federal financial assistance can't discriminate against people with disabilities. And that was basically entities of state and local governments. And state and local governments themselves and entities of them. School systems, libraries, whatever it might be. Funded by police, by government. And it created this concept of reasonable accommodation. And reasonable accommodation was really life was given to it by the Americans with Disabilities Act, but it began in Section 504. And what it changed American thinking, American jurisprudence, it changed. Until then, non-discrimination meant passive behavior. Sit on your hands, do nothing, treat everyone the same way. If Black people come to the bus, they can get on and sit wherever they want. If women apply for the job, if they meet the qualifications, they get it. That was non-discrimination. Reasonable accommodation is not affirmative action. Affirmative action in non-discrimination law meant act affirmatively to benefit a class. Reasonable accommodation does require you to act affirmatively, remove the barrier, change the work hours, buy an accessible something. But that's not considered affirmative action. That's considered the same way passive action and even-handed treatment would be when you deal with most other discrimination issues. That really changed the way people think. And the ADA really created the collective consciousness of that accommodation obligation, but it began in 77. It became a mess though. Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act for Transportation under Jimmy Carter meant lifts on buses, paratransit, new rail stations and things like that to be accessible, and renovations to be accessible. Under Ronald Reagan, only a year later, less than a year later, they withdrew the 504 regulation. In fact, when Reagan got elected, he created a task force, the Presidential Task Force on Regulatory Reform. George H.W. Bush chaired it, the vice president. The first press release said, we're going to go after the transportation regulations implementing Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act because they cost too much money, and the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act regulations, although then it was called the Education for All Handicapped Children's Act. And they were successful with the 504 regulations. They repealed them and issued a special efforts regulation. I'll tell you about that in a minute. But they were not successful with IDEA, with the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. Why? Because parents don't let their kids be abused. And parents fought back. You know, anybody who's a parent listening knows that you'll cut corners on yourself, but you won't let people do it on your kid, and you won't. And the parents felt like IDEA, Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, was just too much of a benefit to lose, and organized and fought the president, and he backed off. The thing that all the time that Reagan was president, his what's called now the National Council on Disability was writing a report called Towards Independence at Reagan's instruction, telling him what Americans needed with disabilities to be integrated in the community and financially independent. And they wrote this report called Towards Independence and gave it to Reagan, and he said, give it back to me in the form of a statute. And that became the Americans with Disabilities Act. So, you know, it's an omnibus law, it covers so much, but the longest part of it in text and the most specific regulations implementing it are transportation. And the reason for that is that there were years and years of intolerable acts, you know, absorbed by the disability community with transportation, like calling it paratransit, but having a phone number and no rides. You can't get a ride, things like that. Inaccessible services, no alternative format for transit information, nothing was there. Reagan said, you don't have to do all these things Carter said, you just have to make a special effort. And the special effort, you didn't even have to tell the feds what it was. You just had to say you're making one and sign something that says you're making one. There was a lawsuit over that. They lost the lawsuit. Then they said, okay, you have to spend an amount equal to 3% of your budget on elderly and disabled people. They didn't say how you had to spend it. 3% of Missoula, Montana's budget wouldn't take one person on paratransit very far. And it had bus service. But 3% was so little, and paratransit so expensive per ride, 3% was a meaningless number in Missoula, Montana. At the time, 3% of MTA's budget was way too much in New York City. 3% of SEPTA's budget was way too much. You know, the benefit to disabled people would be way more in these cities than it would be in Missoula. A Philadelphia lawyer named Tim Cook, who passed away, and Steve Gold and me and a guy named Jim Finari, we sued the feds in Philadelphia about the 3% spending cap and proved it was arbitrary and capricious. And we won that. It went to the Court of Appeals. They appealed it. We won that. And then we didn't want them to take it to the Supreme Court. At the same time as this is happening, the Americans with Disabilities Act, George H.W. Bush is running for president. The Americans with Disabilities Act was introduced in '88, requiring all the things we want in transportation. And Bush, as a presidential candidate against Dukakis, announces he's for the Americans with Disabilities Act, even though he opposed accessible transportation. So we make an appointment to see the Solicitor General of the United States. That's the guy that represents the United States in the Supreme Court. And we met with an assistant named Ken Starr of Monica Lewinsky fame. And we're begging them not to appeal this because Bush, who's vice president, is running for president, supporting what they're appealing. They're the opposite. They're taking opposite positions. The vice president is supporting what we're supporting, and they're trying to get it reversed. Please don't go to the Supreme Court, we say. While we're talking to him, we hear this motor at the Justice Department in DC. We hear this motor noise, and everyone stops talking, wondering what it is, but I knew that it sounded like an electric wheelchair. And sure enough, in comes Evan Kemp in a power chair. Evan Kemp is the guy in the picture you see with President Bush up on the podium with Justin Dart and a reverend named Harold Wilkie with no arms. Guy in a wheelchair, a quad, is Justin Dart. The quad is Evan Kemp. He's the chairman of the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission and friends, very good friends, with the counsel to the vice president at the time, Boyden Gray, who became the counsel to the president when Bush got elected. Evan Kemp comes in. No one invited him to the meeting. We're all in shock. No one knows what he's going to say. And he goes, "I'm here on behalf of the president. He doesn't want you to appeal this case." So the meeting breaks up. We felt great. By the way, they did not take it to the Supreme Court, but they did appeal it. They got another hearing before the Court of Appeals, before all 12 judges, instead of just 3. This is all in Philadelphia, and lost. This opened up the door for lifts on buses nationally. The New York City and Philadelphia deals are similar. The difference was that we had already done New York City. We knew we made a mistake when we allowed anyone to operate paratransit. We had to make it the transit authority responsible. Because if the transit authority isn't responsible for paratransit, they have no incentive to make stations accessible and provide meaningful accessible service on mass transit. We learned that from New York, and we fixed it with the ADA, so New York had to change too. I want to, next slide, please. I wanted to just tell you, I said that this was fun. And let me just go look at the time. I said that this was fun. I believe that there are certain things for people with spinal cord injury, especially really disabling conditions, things that are really life-changing. I believe that rehabilitation is enhanced by some interest. It could be wheelchair sports. How many people have seen wheelchair sports get people out of their shell, out of their homes, out of their shells, socially active? I believe advocacy does that for some people. I've seen it a million times. And I believe public service does that for some people. And working for charities does that for some people, you know? But advocacy is an interesting thing because you get rewarded. You can win. It's not all service. It's rewarding. It feels good. You make friends. You have a common cause, and it makes you bolder than you would be if you didn't have that. I've heard so many ridiculous public officials responding to disabled advocates in my life where they just don't know how to deal with disability. They're better at it now. But people used to argue the rationality of discrimination. I'm jumping ahead of where I was, but where I want to be. But I think we've always seen transportation as a right, healthcare as a right, education as a right. America doesn't and didn't feel that way about people with disabilities. But public officials confronted by disabled people learned their lessons. One of my first cases involved a woman who was a silver medalist in the Paralympics going to a public pool in a town she lived in where all you had to be was a resident. She rolled up in a wheelchair with crutches tucked behind her and was told she could only use the pool on weekday afternoons between the hours of 12 and 2, which were low use hours. She asked why. They said that's the disabled rule for people with disabilities, and she'd have to pass a test administered by the lifeguard in order to use it. She made a scene and got arrested. We got her off, of course, on that. They dismissed everything, but the town was Levittown, Long Island, Levittown, New York. I know you have Levittown, Pennsylvania, but Levittown, New York. And we went to see the parks commissioner, and he was adamant that this was a public safety issue, and we sued them. And he testified that disabled people would be dangerous to themselves and dangerous to everyone else in a public pool. So why? He was asked. And he said, well, you know, they're more vulnerable and they'll divert the attention of the lifeguard. So on cross-examination, he was asked if there's rules about when anybody else can swim. No. Is there rules about passing a swimming test for anyone else? No. So non-swimmers are allowed to use the pool without limitation? Yes. So do you think physically disabled people are more likely to jump in water they can't swim in than able-bodied people? No, I guess not, he says. So we made a point. What about women in really tiny bathing suits? Do you think male lifeguards' attention is diverted by those women? I wouldn't know, he says. Okay, you wouldn't know. I submit that they would, I said, and you have no rule about it, do you? That they can't. He goes, well, if they were really tiny, we would have to say something, and everyone giggled. And we lost that case. We lost that case. The judge wrote disabled people would be dangerous to themselves and dangerous to everyone else in a public pool. I had left legal services. My successor had to appeal it, and he won it. It took 2 years to win that. Judges of people, it was 1970 something, 8 or something. Judges of people, he wasn't ready for this law that said you can't discriminate. He was not getting in the pool with that woman, maybe. Who knows what what his motivation was. Black letter law, you can't refuse, withhold from, or deny admission to a place of public accommodation in New York on the basis of disability. That's exactly what that was. But people argue the rationality. With transit, we were at a public hearing, and the Transit Authority opens up for public comment, and they announced James Weisman, Eastern Paralyzed Veterans Association, and I'm starting to walk up front. And the city council president, who's on the board of the Transit Authority and knows me, went, "You're not a member of the Eastern Paralyzed Veterans Association, are you?" I said, "Thankfully, no." I said, and the chairman of the Transit Authority gave her a look like, stupid question. And she said, "I just wanted to point that out for the record." And someone way in the back yelled out, "What's the matter? We can't hire lawyers?" And the city council speaker said, "Sir, if you would stand up, I could hear you." And he yelled out, "Lady, if I could stand
Sorry,
up, we wouldn't have to be here."
Could you please repeat what you said?
My phone is talking to me.
I'm not sure I understand.
That's Siri talking to me. I don't know what I should do. He said, "Lady, if I could stand up, I wouldn't have to be here." And the whole room got hysterical. She then asked me, "Won't disabled people be victims of crime?" Remember, there's no curb ramps, no accessible buses, no nothing. "Won't disabled people be victims of crime on the subway?" "Probably," I said. And she said, "And yet you would put them there." I said, "No, I wouldn't. I wouldn't." And she goes, "You wouldn't? Isn't that what this is about?" And I said, "Pudding? No. They would go there. They would. Where do you think they are now? They're living in substandard housing or housing projects. They're poor. What are you doing to protect them? You're not doing anything. They will take the train. They will go to work. In New York City, 80% of the people who work take mass transit. They'll do that too. They live in the same city as us. This is their city too. They get it. They know they're vulnerable. They get it. They still have to survive." But people just didn't learn those lessons. They just didn't. Even years later, when we were doing the ADA, and remember, New York City and Philadelphia, they really are the basis for the transportation provisions of the ADA. Not because those settlement agreements were brilliant. They weren't. They were made up by us, by people with disabilities. They weren't made up by transit experts who wouldn't help people with disabilities to do this. Because we were a one-time only client and transit was their clients. And cities, governments, and state governments and transit authorities were fighting access. So not because they were brilliant did they have to put them in the ADA, but because Chicago, Boston, New York City, Philadelphia were the old rail cities. Cleveland had a little old rail system too. And that was it. There was already a deal in New York City and Philadelphia. There was no deal in Boston and Chicago, and they were fighting access. There were Democrats in all four cities, the congressmen. When the Democratic congressmen from Boston and Chicago appealed to their heavy rail system fellow congressmen from New York and Philadelphia, if New York and Philadelphia were grandfathered into the ADA, there would be nothing in it for New York and Philadelphia to help, at least with rail systems requirements, to help Chicago and Boston. And so, because what were they gaining? They already had agreements to do this stuff. So that is why the New York and Philly agreements, which are relatively similar, became basically the requirements for the whole country. The regulations implementing the transportation section are long because they prohibit all kinds of things, like restrictions on trip purpose. So your trip to the adult bookstore is as important as mine to dialysis when we're, same as if I was taking the bus. Or your trip to go shopping is as important as mine to work. And first come, first serve, and too bad, and that kind of thing. And it was supposed to work itself out because there could be no constraints on reasons for travel. And the only reason you can deny a ride is undue financial burden or undue administrative burden, but undue financial burden. And transit authorities' budgets were so big, it would be very hard to create an undue burden. So they had to meet demand. And then the regulations began to allow slippage, an hour window, a half hour before, a half hour after on paratransit, because we had to do a regulation of general applicability for small, medium, and large transit operators. And we all were in Washington after the act passed with small, medium, and large transit operators and disability advocates banging out a regulation. And it's still the regulation. For what it's worth, there's still a lot to go, a lot of improvements to be made. So if you think about transportation as a right, then you think that every new mode of transportation should be accessible. Why should we allow something to come online like Uber or Lyft or autonomous vehicles, self-driving cars, or Airbnb, for that matter, these new cutting-edge tech companies, the gig economy companies? Why should we allow this to become institutionalized and be inaccessible? So we're fighting like hell to not let that happen. We made a deal to make 50% of taxis in New York City accessible by 2020, which is revolutionary in urban environment in the United States. And it's completely undermined by Uber, who gutted our yellow cab system, putting them practically out of business. And making it not financially viable to operate a yellow cab in New York, even though we created a fund to pay for both the maintenance and the purchase of the accessible features in the cabs. It just kills me. We went to battle with Uber. We got New York City to regulate them, and Uber resisted dramatically. Uber went around the country and got over 30 states to pass laws saying that localities couldn't regulate them, only states could. And Houston, which was requiring accessible taxis and would have required Uber to be accessible. Governor Abbott, the wheelchair-using governor, blaming the Green New Deal in Texas for the power outage. That same guy opposed Uber access, a wheelchair-using governor, and allowed that. Meanwhile, Uber has gotten with the program. Uber is rolling out access in 20 American cities now. They're doing it their own way. They're not listening to government because that's their MO. They do it a different way for Pittsburgh than they'll do in New York. They want to get non-emergency medical transportation contracts, i.e. Medicaid, they want to be Medicaid carriers. In New York City, I don't know Philadelphia, but in New York City, it's about $1 billion a year on paratransit and non-emergency medical transportation. So if you are looking for where the money is and you're in the transportation business, you're going to go there. And that's what Uber is doing. I want to leave time for questions and answers. So can we go to the net? I just want to say one more thing about the new modes. These are socially aware customers that are using them. They're using cutting edge technology. They're millennials and even younger than millennials. And these companies are owned by guys, like Uber. Ashton Kutcher is a big investor. They don't want to be on the wrong side of social awareness. So they figured it out. Airbnb is doing a great job. I mean, Airbnb is having a lot of trouble because of COVID, but they're doing a great job with integrating accessible housing into their platform. Next slide, please. I started saying this before. When we were doing disability advocacy in the early days, government and other business defendants, they argued the rationality of their discriminatory practices. Pools are dangerous for people with disabilities. A woman worked for a big department store. Actually, it was Saks Fifth Avenue in New York. And she had a mastectomy, and she came in and said she was fired for having a mastectomy. And so I picked up the phone in front of her, being a cavalier jerk, and called the ladies' shoe department in Saks, got the manager and said, Mrs. So-and-so is with me right now and tells me she was fired because she had a mastectomy. You don't fire people for having mastectomies, so why did you let her go? And he said, well, it wasn't the mastectomy, it was the cancer. Her cancer made her depressed, and it was depressing everyone around her. Well, to get cut to the end of the story, they had to hire her back, and they felt horrible when they realized how insulted she was. Singles dance, a lady in a wheelchair went to a singles dance. Her husband died. Her kids bought her a new pantsuit and pocketbook. Got her hair done at the beauty parlor. They got her a cab. She went to this motel where they were holding a mixer for people her age. And the owner would not let her in because people in wheelchairs don't dance. We actually had to sue that guy. He wouldn't change the policy. These, they're not slam dunks, even though they sound like slam dunks now, because they were all first impression for people. Just last winter, I had a guy who got sued by someone who couldn't get in his store. A really nice guy, had been on the scene for 30 years in the same store. He said, I carry people in wheelchairs. I carry them in, and I'm being sued. Think, a person my age carries people. And I said, you should think, you really should. You're a nice person to carry people, I guess. But how many people don't want to be carried? How many people's quality of life was lessened by never coming in your store? How many people are insulted by the fact that you haven't removed the barrier for 30 years? That looks readily, overcomable. It's not that you're a bad guy. It's that you didn't do what you should do. Carrying is not a solution. It's dangerous. First of all, you can get hurt, but so can the person. And most people don't want it. So, that was just a year ago. So people don't get it. But for the most part, responses to advocacy were weird. They were arguing the rationality of the discrimination, and sometimes that was successful because judges agreed. And you had progress in fits and starts. Now, I think everybody who's elected has heard the term reasonable accommodation, or just about everybody, and understands there's kind of a collective consciousness that's been created about the rights of people with disabilities, both among people with disabilities and in the general public. And so when there's a discriminatory practice alleged, people are better at discussing it. They know what's offensive to say, especially big business or government. But progress is still in fits and starts. Do I have a next slide? No, I don't. Okay. So the fits and starts thing I wanted to talk about, and then we'll open it up. Think about this. The ADA took 22 months. 22 months. To make taxis accessible in New York City was over 20 years of advocacy. The Taxis for All campaign was started 20 years before taxis were accessible by people with disabilities. It was always active. It was always pushing. It got little dribs and drabs of accessible cabs, but not much. But you get something as big as ADA in 22 months. So some things look impossible and they happen. Let's look at airlines. Airlines right now are probably the least accessible places for people with disabilities as an industry that I could think of. And they're going to need huge bailouts. And it's 2021. And if we're not successful in tying bailouts to access, we're crazy. I just feel like this is an industry that has gotten away with murder, especially for wheelchair users, for a long time. Nobody's done this. What if theater owners said, well, we're not going to do it. We're just going to carry people in and seat them. I mean, we would be outraged, but the seating is pretty similar. It's just crazy that we're doing that. So there's things like that that are just still, just an open outrage that hasn't been fixed. And you can name 10 more, and we probably will as we open it up. So I don't know how to do this, but let's take Q&A or comments or.
All right, so we did get a couple of questions and through the chat. So let's see here. So from Hope, she had just brought up about how they're still ignoring people with disabilities today with the COVID vaccination setup until it was actually pointed out to them. She's saying what happens until one has a mobility issue. No one really thinks about it, just kind of seeing what's going on in today's time in terms of.
Yes, everyone with a baby can tell you about curb ramps. It's a remarkable thing. Anyone who's temporarily disabled discovers the curb ramp issue. There's things like that happen all the time. But the vaccination thing has been a nightmare for us because states are all different. The CDC guidelines are being used in the states, but where you fall, when the state triggers each step is different in every state. So right now, like I'm going for my second shot already on Monday because I'm going to be 70. So I'm old enough to get it in New York. People sick are not getting it. People who are actually, cancer, people with cancer are not getting it, but I'm getting it. It doesn't make sense. We've had a huge problem with home care workers too. I'm talking about all over the country now, United Spinal, because we run a resource center and we get a lot of calls from people that need help. In the beginning of COVID, there were home care workers who were exposed and couldn't go to work. They had to isolate, or who got sick and couldn't go to work. There were home care clients who didn't want the home care worker to come because they were taking public transit and they were exposed and they were scrambling for care, the clients, our members. They were doubling up for care and sharing home attendant services. Relatives were filling in, and people were desperate. Nobody wanted to end up in a nursing home, which is the alternative available to most. So this was a nightmare. The nightmare has changed into now the vaccine schedule and people trying to get them and get their home care worker vaccinated as well. In some states, the worker is eligible if you're eligible. I think Connecticut is doing, somebody just told me, maybe it wasn't Connecticut. Connecticut is doing, bring a person over 75 for a shot and you get one. I thought that was a great idea of getting old people vaccinated. But then another problem is people don't want the vaccine. A New York hospital told us the other day that 39% of their workers don't want the vaccine. That's a huge number. That's a huge number. So what if you make it a condition of employment, a condition of going to school? I think that's what's going to end up happening. The anti-vaxxers are scaring people. And there's communities like communities of color who have traditionally shunned vaccine because they were experimented on. We've got to get past that. We got to get past this disease. On the other hand, there's been some pluses with COVID for people with disabilities, like work from home. I will admit that I, as an employer, we have 50-something employees. I've never thought of work from home, even though we're spread out all over the US and we have lots of people working from home. I've never liked it as an employer. I always felt like I need to know more about what they're doing and I need to police them more. And I found out that I was wrong, just wrong. United Spinal has been really productive working from home. And it's opened my eyes, and if it's opened mine, it's opened a lot of employers' eyes to work from home possibilities, which has to benefit people with disabilities. It doesn't mean you can only work from home, and we don't want to get typed that way and pushed into jobs like that. But I do think that employers are looking at it more, especially because they're going to dump space because they realize they don't need it. You know, so many office buildings are going to have apartments in them soon. The only thing I could think.
All right, and we have another couple questions. So Abby had wrote, please tell us more about the TNC landscape. Will they ever evolve to replace what towns and cities use to require of taxi companies? Will they ever be able to take a chunk of demand out of paratransit as transit authorities hope? Can they be made to provide not only wheelchair vans, but SUVs that may be more suitable for manual wheelchair users who want to ride in a regular seat with their chair stowed intact in the cargo area?
Well, I wrote an article over the summer about the 30th anniversary where I said, when people ask me, will something be accessible? I always say yes. I always say yes, because it's not if, it's when. It's not if. So they will, TNCs, that's transportation network companies, that stands for, that's like Uber and stuff. They will be accessible if they want to survive. People will begin to realize what we know, that real-time dispatching instead of day in advance reservation. Why is it day in advance? In fact, I'm so glad you asked this question, because the ADA talks all about no restrictions on trip purpose, no artificial constraints on reasons to travel. Yet it requires a day in advance paratransit reservation. When we did that regulation, that was state of the art. The best you could do to implement this non-discrimination rule was day in advance. And we were going to require it of everybody. Well, the best you can do now is real-time dispatching, just like Uber and Lyft. Transit authorities can do real-time just like they can, right? The reason they're not doing it was with increased demand dramatically. I think it might be easier to administrate, but Uber disagrees with me on that, than day in advance. And they know what they're talking about and I don't. So yeah, I might yield to them on that. But the point of this is non-discrimination, state of the art in 1991 when that reg was enacted, was day in advance. That thing has to be updated to be truly comparable, which is the only word that compares the paratransit requirement to the mass transit requirement. To be comparable, it has to be real-time dispatching. That's a lawsuit waiting to happen. Someone will get that done. But I think the mindset will become that. I think transit will realize that to be relevant in the 2020s, to be vital, to be part of people's lives, you have to do what people need. If they ran horse and buggies, nobody would take them. Their system will become horse and buggy-like if they don't. They can incorporate Uber. Uber could have when I say Uber, I mean Uber type services, the TNC type services. And they're going to quickly be changing to autonomous vehicles. Self-driving cars are upon us. Waymo, the Google-owned company, self-driving, called today, and asked me, can I set up a meeting with New York City advocates? They want to loosen the requirements about testing autonomous vehicles in New York, that they're too strict. So they need a constituency. They're not going to have a constituency of people with disabilities if they're not talking about access. There are all coalitions now. I wish I could think of what PAVE stands for, but that's the initials of one, and We Will Ride, and United We Ride, and it's all about making TNCs accessible. But the TNCs are participating. They're trying to get it their way, to do it their way, but it's not like they're just giving you the cold shoulder and the stiff arm. It's not like it used to be, because they know that's where the money is. People are going to live to be 100. They're not going to be healthy. They're going to be slow and they're going to need access. People are going to work longer than they've ever worked in human history in their lives. They're not going to be retiring at 60 and 65 or dying. They're going to be working and trying to make a living. They're going to need accessible environments to work in, and they're going to need transportation, despite all this work from home. So I think, yeah, they will be. And I think that they'll do it because there's a business reason to do it, which is the only reason they do anything.
All right. And Wendy had actually asked earlier about air travel and more accessibility. She wanted to know if you could just elaborate a little bit more on how we can best advocate for this.
Well, United Spinal is planning absolutely nothing. So this is a good time to start because we haven't really talked about this, except for me, like, pontificating. But I feel like if the government is going to do something for them, we've always been able to be successful getting government to force the private sector to do what we want if they take aid from the public, from the government. And I think we might be able to do that with the airlines. Airlines have argued for years, the same way Greyhound did actually, when they were opposing the ADA, that every inch is, precious, and disabled people basically take up room and displace other paying customers, and we can't accommodate them because we're barely making it. That may be true that they're barely making it, but I don't think that they should be kept in business at the expense of people with disabilities. If that's the issue, come on. There's a million other things you can do, I once had a dentist told me that he bought hedges to put around the entrance to his office instead of putting, that he has a budget for capital improvements every year. And he was supposed to ramp the entrance because ADA requires barrier removal, but he put hedges. And he said he had no money to do it. And I said, well, you put the hedges. It was all around a parking lot. It was a big thing. That thinking is kind of the airline thinking, I think. There's all kinds of improvements in airlines. You've seen them. They just aren't accommodating people with disabilities. I feel like anything that goes on now with bailing them out, we have to get Congress to tie strings to it, to make them accessible. It's ridiculous that this airline is limping along behind the rest of business in the United States and getting away with it, that airlines can do it. I see Wendy saying something. What does it say, Wendy? Can you read that, Megan? I think you're on mute, Megan.
Wendy had said United Spinal should take the lead on airline access.
Yeah, PVA has done a real lot on this too. And I really agree with you. And now that I'm not CEO anymore and don't have to worry about all the things that you have to worry about, the temptation when you're CEO, if you read this new mobility article that was very, very flattering about me, I'm embarrassed by it. But one of the things I said is the temptation. I was the lawyer forever, and I've only been CEO for 6 years, and then I stopped. The temptation when you're CEO is to balance the books, to make sure that the place is clean, to make sure that, to do all the things bosses are supposed to do, to raise the money to pay everybody. And the mission is different than that. The mission is let's make the world a better place. So if you can't take your eye off that ball, you just can't. You have to keep pushing so that at the same time as you're balancing the books, you're making autonomous vehicles accessible. And it's a struggle to do both, for an organization to do both. But I feel like because of our chapter structure, and by enhancing the chapter structure and working with the chapters and having an advocacy network, and we're trying to get a representative in every congressional district in the United States, 435. We have 200 and low 200s now. But we'll do it. We'll do it even if we have to move quad into the middle of the desert. We'll do it because we want to get every district covered, because it's important to be able to speak to power. It's important for people to advocate for themselves. Some of you who've been to the Roll on Capitol Hill, which we're going to do virtually this year and have over 200 people participate instead of 100 on the Hill visits, which will be done by Zoom. It's a company called Soapbox. It's a Zoom style meetings with Congress people and their staffs. But when we do the in-person Roll on Capitol Hill, and a person comes from Hawaii, a quadriplegic in a motorized chair, and goes to see their senator and brings them a lei from Hawaii and puts it around her neck and then starts talking about what people with disabilities in Hawaii need, they remember that as long as they live, those senators. I was sitting on a plane and on a shuttle from Washington, and my congressman sat down right next to me, my ex-former congressman named Steve Israel. And I looked at him and I said, "Are you Steve Israel?" And he said, "Yeah, I am." I said, "I'm your constituent." He said, "Where do you live?" We talked. And he said, "I've met you before, right?" I said, "Yes, you have." And he said, "When?" And I said, "Well, we do this thing called the Roll on Capitol Hill." And I took out my card and he saw the logo of United Spinal. He goes, right. You brought two guys in wheelchairs and I was on the House floor and I was supposed to be in my office to meet you and they called me and I came off." He goes, "Those," and I said, "Listen, you're right. I can't believe you remember it." He goes, "That was a great meeting with those two guys." I go, "They remember it as long as they live. You opened the door from the House of Representatives." Now I guess anybody can go, but very few people had been on the floor of the House of Representatives that weren't rioters or congressmen. And these two guys were right there because the congressman came out to meet them. I said, "They remember it as long as they live that you did that." And he goes, "And I remember it too. Look, I remember it too." Those kind of things, that kind of rubbing shoulders and interaction and meeting people changes things for people with disabilities. Strange things happen. Norman Mineta was a congressman from California. He was the Secretary of Transportation, and he was also a Secretary of Commerce for both Republicans and Democrats, but he was a Democratic mayor of San Jose, California first. Then he became a congressman. Then he became cabinet level for Obama and for Bush. Mineta was the chairman of the Surface Transportation Committee. Schuster, that's a Pennsylvania name you all know. Schuster was from Altoona, was a congressman that was the chair of the whole Transportation Committee. Schuster's mother was a wheelchair user. Schuster opposed lifts on buses. He was a Democrat. He opposed lifts on buses. At one of the hearings on ADA, he held up his hands and he goes, "You see these knuckles? These knuckles are bleeding." They weren't. "These knuckles are bleeding from pushing my mother through doorways that are too narrow. I know what you're talking about, but I wouldn't put my mother on a public bus." She's an old lady. "Right," we said, "but your mother doesn't stand for anybody but your mother, But Mineta, on the other hand, who chaired the subcommittee under him on surface transit, was mayor of San Jose before he was a congressman. As mayor, he did one of those things that we make fun of. He did one of those disability days where they blindfold you and plug your ears and stick you in a wheelchair if you're an elected official, and then they experience disability. But this thing that I've made fun of changed Mineta. He met people with disabilities that day. There was real interaction. He put lifts on buses in San Jose. People used them. And when he got to Congress, he knew that it worked and that it was cheaper than paratransit. He wasn't going to let Schuster just bully this. And he opposed his committee chair to do it. By the way, Mineta was one of those Japanese people that was, as a child, put in a camp in Wyoming. He lived in San Francisco area. They put him in Wyoming in a displaced persons camp, where they put Japanese during the war. And he actually met, who was the senator from Wyoming? I can't think of his name. They met through the fence as boys. One became a conservative Republican, one became a Democratic senator. They both went to Congress, and they knew each other through the fence of the camp. But Mineta was completely a believer in the rights of people with disabilities because he experienced people with disabilities. I always say exposure is everything, everything. But I've really been wrong about education. I really thought, I found something I wrote in 1990 that said that by 2005, 30 years after Individuals with Disabilities Education Act passed, by 2005, there'd be no more disability discrimination because kids have been integrated for 30 years with disabilities. How could there still be discrimination? Here we are, 2021, 6 years after I thought discrimination against disabled people would be gone. And discrimination is real and still there. And that school thing, I'm sure it's done wonders for a lot of people. I'm sure it's changed the status quo. But I always thought that when people went to public school together, that disability would become like fat and skinny and glasses and braces, and kids would torture each other just like they do, but it would be minimized because of that. Disabled kids would be tempered and would be ready for the adult world, and their classmates would understand disability, would know that they were smart and funny, and they'd have disabled girlfriends and boyfriends. And I'm pretty much wrong about that, I think. I mean, there's a bazillion exceptions, but I still think there's profound disability discrimination, especially about mental health and intellectual disabilities. And I don't understand why. Exposure obviously is not the only solution. There's something else. One of them is getting disabled people who want to assimilate, and we want them to assimilate more than anything, right? But we also want them, it's almost like a competing desire. We want them to identify with their disabled status and do something about it to help other people with disabilities. I love when disabled people have important jobs. I love when they have jobs, but I love when they have important jobs because they can help other disabled people or at least be role models. I love when somebody with a disability gets a job that has nothing to do with disability, nothing to do with it at all. They're just the best at it. I once got a reporter ask me when there was a recession, did I think that disabled people would be the first to lose their jobs? No, I said. I think they'll be the last to be hired, maybe. But I don't think they'll be the first to lose their jobs, because if they're already working and an employer knows they're good, why would he fire them first? He'd fire the worst employee first. But if they're not working, maybe bias would prevent it. But I didn't think that. But I do know that there's still profound discrimination out there, and I hear it all the time. So it's not like they're rare and few and far between. So I'm a little puzzled by it. I mean, I know that it's millennia of discrimination we're trying to overcome. So I sound a little naive saying I'm puzzled by it. It's only been a few years of non-discrimination. But if you're looking for social change, you've found it in some ways and you haven't gotten it in other ways.
All right, we have a couple more questions, if that's okay.
Go ahead.
So in the question answer box, they are originally from Atlanta, Georgia, where 2 years ago, a multi-billion-dollar class action lawsuit was filed against city for non-ADA compliant sidewalks and the missing federal money sent down. However, city planners and stakeholders who never include the disability community. How do we get through to them proactively?
Well, you got to be in their face. You got to put things in writing, not in letter form, in email form. Curb ramps is a particularly interesting one. It's an old requirement. The ADA required cities to have all their curbs ramped by 95 unless they had an undue hardship. Most cities had an undue hardship to do it. It's physically impossible. We sued New York City in 1990, late 93, I think. And we're just settling now. I know that sounds crazy, but we've had 3 different settlements. It keeps being updated. And we'll have spent, by the time this is over, this curb ramp agreement is implemented, New York City has 168,000 or so corners. It will be $1 billion on curb ramps, $1 billion. So city governments obviously could spend $1 billion in ways that would benefit re-election better than curb ramps. So you really have to get their face in your hands and make them understand this is the requirement, or they're not going to do it. I mean, it's expensive. It's not discretionary. When we met with a judge in the 90s on this in his chambers, he said, what about all the potholes? I said, there's no law that says they have to fill them. There's a law that says they have to do the curb ramps. Doesn't that make a difference to you? I didn't say to you, to the judge, but doesn't that make a difference? And it does, it should make a difference. Some things are discretionary and some things aren't. Hedges around your parking lot are discretionary. Ramping the entrance isn't. It just isn't. You know, removing barriers. It's the law. It's not discretionary, but people, you know, people are people. And unless you can be everywhere, as my mother would have said, unless you can be in 12 places with one behind, you can't solve everybody's problems. You know, but it's self-defeating to think of it that way. You got to speak truth to power. You got to be in their face. It helps if you have a champion, you know, somebody in government, local government, who becomes your champion. Volunteering for campaigns is another one of those emancipating activities like wheelchair sports and advocacy, where you get to know people, you get to know an elected official, and more importantly, he gets to know, or she gets to know you, and you end up working for that person or influencing their decisions. Those of you that remember the Democratic National Convention that nominated Hillary Clinton might remember there was a disabled woman who spoke named Anastasia Somoza. Cerebral palsy she had, I think, in a motorized chair. Anastasia was my client when she was 9 years old. And she's in I don't know, probably about 40 now. But she was my client when she was a little girl. She and her twin sister were being carried up and down 3 flights every day in Hell's Kitchen in Manhattan to go to school by her parents. She ended up going to Yale and working in the White House. She did pretty well. People like that, she now works for the city council president in New York. Her job is every piece of legislation that goes through city council, she's supposed to figure out what is its effect on people with disabilities. I think those kind of jobs are great. We have one in New York City Transit now. Every transit policy gets run by this guy. Is it going to help or hurt? Because hurting people with disabilities costs transit money. It makes people more paratransit dependent. And they don't have an undue burden defense, really. So it makes sense from both points of view, the people with disabilities point of view or not. And having a gatekeeper or an ombudsman or whatever you want to call that, somebody that looks at legislation or policy as it affects people with disabilities is great. And pushing for that in local government is a good idea because it solves some problems. You have a go-to person.
All right, so a question from Abby, kind of along similar route here. Do you agree that an important way to advance the willingness of governments and businesses to integrate accessibility into their systems and priorities is to make those who use wheelchairs more visible by making our streetscapes, such as sidewalks, more navigable?
Absolutely. I absolutely do. I feel like I told you I think exposure is everything, but I also think it's much harder for you to be successful if you're a person with a disability, if you are operating in an environment that's hostile. I don't know if Philadelphia has a scooter program, you know, these electric scooters. Are e-scooters happening in Philadelphia?
Not that I have seen yet, no.
Okay, so in New York, they're doing a request for proposals now. Washington, D.C., so we don't have them in New York yet. You know, kind of like City Bike, where they have the bike, and this is an electric scooter. Washington, D.C. allows it. People in wheelchairs go crazy. You find these things, you can leave them anywhere because they're found by GPS. And when you want to get one, you just look on your phone and you can find the one that someone's left somewhere. People leave them, blocking public rights of way. Blind people fall over them. Wheelchair users can't get around them. New York City had a meeting with the potential bidders, because they always have bidders meetings on big contracts. And they brought the mayor's office for people with disabilities commissioner into the meeting with the Department of Transportation commissioner and said, none of you will be, they're doing different demonstrations in different boroughs and they're trying to get different companies involved. None of you will be successful bidders if your scooters can be left to impede public rights of way so wheelchair users can't get around them. That was one of the criteria that they had to meet. That's a brand new phenomenon in government. Thinking of people with disabilities before you implement the program, it's usually an expensive afterthought. So you can do this, you can get there, you can raise their awareness. It's always issue by issue, unfortunately, but you can raise levels of awareness by getting in people's face. I don't mean that in a mean way, I mean in a polite way. I don't mean in a rioting way or a rude way, but I do think that there's a place for organized demonstrations. If you are a radical who's going to chain yourself to something until they change it to make it better for you, you are necessary and you push the ball down the field, you'll probably not be at the table when the deal is made. They probably think of you as a nut, but you did a good job, right? I mean, everyone has their niche, you know. If they think you're crazy, they still may do what you want. They may, because you have to make it, successful advocacy makes it harder to do what they want than what you want, right? It's harder for government or business or whoever it is to just continue doing what they want to do. You've made it so hard for them to do that they're going to do what you want to do because it's the path of least resistance. Now that takes a lot. Or you end up with a champion in local government who pleads your case with you and for you. The best advocacy is done by people with disabilities, for people with disabilities, because you're trying to show that you're, you know, a whole citizen you should have the same rights as everybody else. It's good to be a self-advocate. It's good to be out there. And out there is now in there. You can do it with Zoom. It's a lot easier to go to town hall meetings and things like that if they're set up that way. I just wanted to review they're building something near my house. I wanted to see what they were doing. And I called the village planning department, and the guy says, well, you got to come in. And I said, even in times of COVID, I have to come in. You can't just let me see this online. And he goes, oh, yeah, I guess I can. But he did it. He did it. I think local government is having to deal with this more, this COVID thing of that electronics is becoming more and more important. And I think that's good for us, that we can attend more meetings, be more present.
There was a question about the roll conference. Vicki wants to know, will there be captions provided?
I would say yes, but I don't know. I'm writing that down to get a good answer to that, but I would say yes. I'm pretty sure you get a transcript too when it's over. Pretty sure they told me that. I'm writing this down, Vicki. Thank you. Because that's important. So what we did is we brought 100 people from all over the country the last 8 years or 9 years, I forget, to Washington. And we trained them for a day. We have a reception at night, the first night, everybody gets to know each other. We train them for a day on issues. And then the next day they go to Capitol Hill at appointments we've made. They meet with Congress people and legislators. And then we have a reception on Capitol Hill where we give Advocate of the Year awards to people and stuff and have their congressperson give it to them. And then we debrief everybody to find out what Congress said to them. And that helps our advocacy effort. And we video it so we can use clips for advocacy purposes. But we were bringing people from chapters. There are lots of people not in chapters all over the United States. If you're in an urban area or a suburban area, you're probably in a chapter. If you're in a rural area, it's tougher. There's a lot of old-time members who weren't in chapters and just continue that way. We'd like to reach areas of the country that are strategic to us for the role purposes. So now that we have 200 boxes, in the Zoom style role on Capitol Hill, we'll be able to set up more meetings, and we can recruit people from areas where we do not have chapters, but where Congress people are important. There might be a guy from, I don't know, Montana where we don't have a chapter. Maybe we do, I don't know. I don't think we do. Who's really important and we want to talk to him. We'll get a member from there, and I do know a member from there who's an activist, who will attend the role on Capitol Hill too that way. So you're going to get material any day about the new role on Capitol Hill from us. I think it might even be tomorrow, but maybe not. But in the 20s. So you'll get it next week. That will announce what we're doing, and then if you have questions, there'll be ways to people to ask on there. But it's going to make our reach even bigger, which I'm very excited about. I feel like we've had lots of success with the role on Capitol Hill, both in raising the visibility of United Spinal, which is very important, but in raising the awareness of Congress people and their staffs. Their staffs are usually pretty young. So even though they're pretty smart, the staff members, and that they know a lot about a lot of different subjects, because that's their job. Even though they're pretty smart, they don't have a lot of world experience because they're young. And when they meet adults with disabilities who are self-directed and advocacy oriented, they usually respond in great ways. It's a charge to them. It gets them excited. They like it. The Congress people always like it because there's nothing like a picture taken with a person with a disability to put in your newsletter. I'm being jaundiced now. I don't mean that. The Congress people always like it because they love if people come out of their way to see them. They know you're going to go home and tell people. And that you talk about word of mouth. Their whole job is word of mouth. If people don't like them, except for Ted Cruz, they don't get reelected. That was a joke, by the way.
All right, we have another comment from Abby, suggesting that United Spinal should challenge the federal government to do better in achieving their hiring goals for those with disabilities. She says the intentions are fine, but the feds don't make it easy for the disabled to find out what jobs are available and suitable. And she has a Schedule A hiring link that she posted, and just encouraging people to utilize that link and ask for Anthony Napoli about how well EPA is doing.
I do think that it could be better. Job vacancy announcements, state government too, city government too. I do think it could be better, but in the Obama years, they created goals that were much broader and bigger than in the past. And according to the Department of Labor, they're trying to meet them at the federal level. I'm curious, there's been this black hole the last 4 years about information, but I'm curious now with the Biden administration where they stand on percentages and are they even coming close to goals? And I'm sure we'll find all that out. Oh, by the way, one thing I should say about Biden administration, I was on the transition team call about disability for the Department of Transportation. And I'm telling you, the people on that call from the Biden side were terrific. Transit is transit. That's not US DOT, right? US DOT doesn't run a single bus or a train. They're an agency that distributes money to these cities. But the people that are there and the people that are going to be in FTA, Federal Transit Administration, which is the mass transit funding agency, are enlightened people. They're people who have either lost lawsuits and come around or led the way. The deputy secretary, the number 2 person at DOT now, was the New York City Department of Transportation commissioner who made the deal to put in $1 billion worth of curb ramps. She gets it. Her name is Polly Trottenberg, and I know she gets it. I know her. You don't have to start from ground zero with her. From scratch. She knows where you're coming from on this. She may say we don't have the money, but she knows exactly what you're talking about and agrees with the premise. In fact, transit is different in general, not just those people. Transit managers now, a person in their 30s or 40s, grew up with ADA. Transit managers now know you're entitled to things. They get it. They may not be doing it, but they absolutely know what their responsibilities are in transit. And that's very different than it was for a long, long time. That generation of transit management had to turn over, and the opposition, and it did. It really did. New transit people get it. They want things to be accessible. They want people on mass transit, not on paratransit. They don't want people unnecessarily separated. If only for money, it's cheaper to put them on mass transit. So as soon as I say something, I know there's an exception to it, and it bothers me that I know there's pushback too. So, but I do think transit management is enlightened now.
All right, and we have a lot of thanks going on in the chat for your presentation tonight. Excitement for the book that's coming out.
They're talking about me?
Wendy says, can't wait to read your book.
Okay, so I just started it. This is an interesting thing. I've never done anything like this. I write columns all the time, but that's it. And legal stuff in the old days, I used to have to write a lot, but I never wanted to tell the story. I never had time to really tell the story except for doing something like this. But people with disabilities have done remarkable things. And so I want to write a book about, telling the stories. And I'm bogged down now in chronology. Like, does everything have to make sense in a row? And no, I don't. That's a boring book. And I'd rather talk about the people who made it happen. And if it fits chronologically, great. But if it doesn't, that's great too. And I'm really struggling to get the voice I want to write in. And it's harder than I thought it would be to get started. But I really do want to do it. And I read this book a few years ago called Al Franken, Giant of the Senate, by Al Franken. And, it was the funniest book. It was laugh out loud on public transportation funny, but it was loaded with policy, loaded with it. But he just told funny stories to illustrate it. And I read that and I said, I think I can do this. So that's really what I want to do. I want to make sure that everybody gets what we're trying to say. I don't want it to get lost in funny stories, but I do want it to be palatable. I want people to get it. That it's not this like a requirement like toilets have to be 18 inches on center from the wall, or ramps have to be 1 in 12, or cross slopes can't be more than X%. That's what people think about in when they think about these ADA lawsuits and all this stupid crap. I want them to understand the human beings on the other end, on the receiving end, the human beings you're either discriminating against or accommodating, and the remarkable things that happen that you don't believe. I'll leave you with a story that I love to tell because it's about the remarkable things that happen, and it's so stupid and petty that it's easily forgettable. But for me, it's 30 years old and I'm still talking about it. I went to the ADA bill signing. I was invited by the White House and I felt like $1 million. 1990, I was 39. My kids were little, they were there. Daddy's going to the White House, and it was like this big deal. And I got in a cab in DC, and I said to the White House, which is like, you don't get to do stuff like that. And I felt so important. And I walked up to that little booth you always see, on TV, with the guards. And the guy said, first of all, you're on the wrong side of the White House. You have to go around the other side. And when I went around there were, I don't know how many people, 1,000 people with disabilities on the White House. I don't even know how many, hundreds of people with disabilities on the White House lawn. I thought I'd be like one of like 12 or 20, And when I got there, I felt so silly and so insignificant and small and so lucky to be riding the crest of this wave that happened with me, I think how many people have lived and died trying to make this happen. And, I was there, to see it. And when the bill is being signed, if you remember that photo, everybody's seen that iconic ADA photo with President Bush sitting on the platform there. And Evan Kemp, who I talked about, was over here. And Justin Dart was over here. And Sandy Perino, who chaired the National Council on Disability, was behind him. And on the other shoulder behind him is a guy in clerical garb named Reverend Harold Wilkie. And Reverend Harold Wilkie was a minister in DC. And he, I think DC, he was a amputee at the shoulder. He had no arms at all. And he was standing with his empty sleeves next to the president. And the president has pens lined up on the table in front of him to sign the bill into law. And he's George H.W. Bush, so he signs a G with a pen and he gives it to somebody important, and he signs an E with a pen and he gives it to him. And he's looking out at us, at the audience, President Bush, and these people are behind him who are getting their pen. And Reverend Wilkie stepped up to get his pen. And Reverend Wilkie has no arms at all. And President Bush held up the pen like this, and Reverend Wilkie took off his shoe. He's in his 50s. I'm sure he's 50-ish at the time. Took off his shoe, grabbed the pen in his socked foot, and put it in his pocket. And President Bush has this big smile on, and oh, isn't this amazing? For me, this is the metaphor that's the whole ADA. Wilkie could do that. You can't do it. I can't do it, but he could do it. He wouldn't have stepped up there to get that pen if he couldn't do it. He wouldn't have. He would have figured something out, but he wouldn't have done it. And just because you can't think, I mean, you can't imagine it. Could you imagine the internet? No, you couldn't imagine that. Could you imagine Uber? No, you couldn't imagine that. Could you imagine autonomous vehicles if you weren't watching the Jetsons? You couldn't imagine that. So it doesn't matter what you can imagine. You've been wrong a million times. You're going to be wrong about people with disabilities too if you're just using your head. You have to look, you have to experience it, you have to be exposed, you have to watch it, you have to see it happen. And as far as I'm concerned, that was the Wilkie day. That was what Wilkie did. The real story, by the way, is it's a great story for me. But the whole story is that there was a guy who worked for Congressman Dingell that was opposing ADA because it covered mentally disabled people. And he wanted to amend, Dingell wanted to amend the ADA when it was going through the House of Representatives to exclude intellectually and psychologically impaired people. And the reason why was he had seen a show about Tourette's syndrome on LA Law, and he didn't want one of those people with Tourette's taking Amtrak because his granddaughters took Amtrak to see him in Washington, and people with Tourette's scream out obscenity. So we explained that people with Tourette's are already on Amtrak. They don't need ramps and elevators. And it doesn't seem to be a problem. And he did not change his position. So we got mental health advocates to advocate from Michigan. And Dingell angry at us, changed his position and supported the ADA with the original definition, including mentally disabled people. To do that, we brought a guy named, I think his name was Clater, who was running Amtrak to see Dingell. And he explained to Dingell that Amtrak doesn't want to be policing who's too disabled and who's crazy and who's not eligible. And they do ticket sales to people that have the money. And that's what that's the requirement for admission. And if we don't sell tickets to Black people because they're Black, we should be sued. And if we don't sell tickets to disabled people because they're disabled, we should be sued. We don't need the protection. Thank you very much. Dingell and Clater walk out. And the guy that works for Dingell says to us, what about people who eat with their feet? What about people who eat with their feet? Well, would you want to take Amtrak, he says, and sit next to someone who eats with their feet? And no one says anything. And I go, yes. And he goes, you would? Yes, I said, I'm around disability all the time. I've only seen that a few times in my life. For only $200, you get to Chicago and get to see a guy eat with his feet. And there's laughing and uncomfortable laughter and snickering. And we went out of there looking at each other like, do you believe this guy? So then we're all at the White House lawn. And so is the aide to Dingell. And so 1,000 people are thinking, isn't this terrific when he takes the pen with his foot? But the aide to Dingell is thinking the bill is not even signed yet. And one of those people who eats with his feet is up there with the president. These are remarkable kind of, remarks about people with disabilities by people that just don't know what they're talking about. I know that he's heard that I tell this story, and he's asked me not to tell it anymore. So I still tell it, but I don't say his name. It's a compromise. Well, thanks to everyone. This was a lot of fun for me. I'm in book writing mode, so I'm very much in a reminiscing mode. It's fascinating to think, because when we started, there was really nothing. When I said in the beginning there was darkness, there was nothing. There was institutionalization or back rooms or attics. And it's only been, 40, 50 years of disabled advocacy. And that's pretty much changed. It's still not great, but that's pretty much changed. And I think people realize there's a a social obligation to change the status quo for the better as it relates to disability. And it's because people like, us, people like you and I, we're out there plugging. We have to keep doing it. There's people behind us who I know appreciate it. I hear from them. I do know that people get it, that we're doing this for them. I don't hear from them a lot, but I do hear from enough people that I know that this is meaningful and real and changes people's lives for the better. And that if we don't do it, it won't. Someone has to be, whoever it is, if not us, who, and if not now, when. I really feel like that's our mission, that's United Spinal, that's its chapters, that's what we should be doing for each other. So thanks, everybody. And my email is jweisman@unitedspinal.org. So if you want to talk, send me an email. I'm happy to do it. Maybe we'll even get on the phone. And to all my old friends, Philly, thank you very much.
Everyone really appreciated it. Thanks so much, James.
My pleasure.
Good night, everybody. See you next month.
Bye-bye.